suddenly broken by the sound of clanking armor, the shouts of orders from the officers, and the snap of ropes being tied around Jesus' wrists. The disciples, until then confused and stunned, find themselves faced with the brutal reality: their master is being captured. Peter, filled with impulse, draws his sword and charges into the attack. In an impulsive gesture of defense, Peter strikes at Malchus, the servant of the high priest. The edge of the blade meets his flesh, cutting off his ear. Malchus screams in pain, bringing his hand to the blooded side of his face. Panic ensues. The soldiers prepare to retaliate. But then, before any greater conflict can occur, Jesus intervenes. He looks at Peter and says, firmly and serenely, "Put away your sword. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Peter, panting and confused, sheathes his blade. Jesus then approaches Malchus, who is still groaning in pain. With a simple touch, the wounded ear is restored. The miracle silences even the soldiers. What kind of prisoner heals one of his tormentors? Jesus does not resist. The soldiers and temple guards bind him, tying his hands with rough ropes. He is led out of the garden, illuminated only by the flickering glow of torches. The disciples, filled with fear, hesitate. If they stay, they may be arrested too. If they fight, they may be killed. And so, one by one, they flee. As Jesus is dragged down the dark path, Judas stands still, motionless. He watches the guards take his master away. He feels the weight of the silver coins in his pouch. Regret begins to take shape. But now, there is no turning back. Jesus' journey is just beginning. He will first be taken to the house of Annas, the former high priest. From there, he will be transferred to trial before Caiaphas, and then face the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. The betrayals, humiliations, and injustices are yet to come. And Judas, will he bear the guilt? Malcho's blood was running down his face, his scream of pain echoing through the garden. The guards instinctively stepped back, preparing to retaliate. Pedro's attack could have been the spark for a deadly confrontation. The Roman soldiers and the temple guards had witnessed rebellions before. One wrong move, and everyone there could be massacred. But before chaos could ensue, Jesus stepped forward. With a serene look, he raised his hand and commanded, "Enough." Pedro, still panting, felt his hands tremble on the hilt of the sword. He wanted to fight. But Jesus did not want that. The master then turned to Malcho, who was still pressing his hand against his bloody ear. With compassion, Jesus approached. The soldiers watched with suspicion, but did not prevent his action. Why would a prisoner be helping one of his tormentors? Then, before everyone, Jesus touched Malcho's wound. In an instant, the pain disappeared. The cut flesh was restored. The blood stopped flowing. Malcho's eyes widened. He touched the side of his head, dazed. His ear was intact. The silence that followed was overwhelming. The soldiers exchanged glances. Some looked hesitant. They had been sent to arrest a criminal. But now they were witnessing a miracle before their eyes. But orders were orders. Jesus turned to Pedro, still holding his sword. "Put your sword away. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Pedro, panting, did not know how to respond. His instinct was to protect his master, but Jesus was not fighting against his arrest. And then, Jesus continued, "Do you not think that I could ask the Father, and he would send 12 legions of angels to deliver me?" That statement struck the disciples like a shock. 12 legions of angels? If each Roman legion had about 6,000 soldiers, that meant Jesus could summon more than 72,000 angels to destroy that human army. But he did not. And, looking at the soldiers holding the ropes to bind him, Jesus added, "But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, that say it must happen this way?" It was a choice. Jesus was willingly surrendering. Pedro dropped the sword, defeated by the truth. The guards then advanced and tightly bound Jesus, pulling his hands behind his back. It was at that moment that panic took hold of the disciples. If they arrested Jesus, what would they do with them? John looked around, searching for a plan. James stepped back. Andrew hesitated. But it was Peter who took the first step back. And then, like falling dominoes, they all fled. Some got lost among the trees of the garden, others ran desperately through the dark streets of Jerusalem. The Master was alone. He knew this would happen. Yet still, the pain of loneliness pierced him. The soldiers dragged him along the dirt path, while the torches illuminated the beginning of his journey to trial. As the guards led Jesus out of Gethsemane, Judas stood still. He saw everything happen. The kiss, Jesus' gaze, Peter's sword, Malcho's healing. He saw Jesus being taken away, and something inside him began to shatter. The glimmer of the silver coins in his bag no longer brought satisfaction. His plan had worked. But then why did his heart weigh like a stone? The guards marched, leading Jesus through the dark streets of Jerusalem. The walk to Jesus' trial had begun. He would first be taken to the former high priest Annas, then to the high priest Caiaphas, and finally face the cruelest trial in history before Pontius Pilate. But as Jesus walks toward his destiny, Judas Iscariot begins to face the consequences of his betrayal. Will he bear the guilt? And the disciples? Will any of them return to help their master? The Roman Empire is already involved in this process, and the politics between Jews and Romans will be decisive for Jesus' fate. The city was shrouded in the twilight of dawn. The torches flickered along the stone alleys, casting dancing shadows against the walls of the houses. The Roman soldiers and the temple guards marched alongside Jesus, leading him through the streets of Jerusalem. The footsteps echoed in the silence of the night. For the temple guards, this was just another arrest. For the Roman soldiers, he was just another prisoner among many. But for Jesus, this was the walk that would determine the fate of humanity. As he walked, the weight of the ropes tightened around his wrists, but it was insignificant compared to the weight of the mission he bore. The unusual movement stirred some residents who peeked through windows and ajar doors. "Who is this prisoner?" they whispered. "It's Jesus of Nazareth." Someone replied, "The master who healed the sick? The one who multiplied loaves and fish?" Yes. Judas, one of his disciples, betrayed him. The murmurs grew louder. Some felt compassion, others disdain. Among the Pharisees and religious leaders, there was satisfaction. They had finally captured the man who challenged their authority. But among the poor and sick who had been healed by him, fear grew. The group arrived at the first point of the long night of trials, the house of Annas, the former high priest. Annas no longer held the official position, but his influence was still strong within the Sanhedrin. He was a powerful, cunning, and strategic man. The guards brought Jesus to him, and Annas observed him with a cold gaze. "So, you are the man who has caused so much turmoil in Jerusalem?" he said with disdain. Jesus remained silent. His silence was not fear. It was a silence filled with purpose. Annas grew irritated with the lack of response. "Speak! What do you teach your followers? What power do you claim to have?" Jesus lifted his gaze and, with serenity, replied, "I have always spoken openly to the world. I taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews gather. I said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I told them. They know what I said." His answer was clear. He hid nothing. His message had always been public. But the leaders did not want the truth. They wanted a justification to condemn him. Jesus' response disturbed one of the guards, who stepped forward and slapped his face hard. The dry sound of the aggression echoed through the hall. "Is this how you answer the high priest?" the guard said angrily. Jesus turned his face slowly, feeling the sting of the blow. But there was no hatred in his gaze. Only compassion. "If I spoke wrongly, tell me what it was. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me?" Jesus' response created discomfort in the atmosphere. Even some guards holding him avoided looking directly at him. It was as if, at that moment, they realized they were not facing an ordinary criminal. But Annas did not care. He wanted Jesus to be taken to someone with real power to condemn him. Take him to Caiaphas. And so, Jesus' walk continued. The night was still far from over. Jesus would be taken to the high priest Caiaphas, where he would face a trial full of contradictions and false testimonies. Meanwhile, Peter, who had sworn never to abandon him, would face his own trial. The moment was chaotic. The torches swayed with the movement of the soldiers, casting distorted shadows on the olive trees. The sound of swords and the guards' orders mixed with the cries of the disciples. Peter still held the sword tightly, his breath quickening. He looked around and realized the reality: they were surrounded. "Get them too," one of the soldiers ordered. It was enough to trigger a primitive instinct in the disciples. The urge to flee dominated their bodies. James ran first, followed by John. Andrew stumbled over a root, hurriedly got up, and disappeared among the trees. Matthew, the former tax collector, felt the fear of the past return. He saw a soldier approaching and dashed in the opposite direction, vanishing into the darkness. "No! Don't leave him!" Peter shouted, but his voice was lost in the confusion. Peter himself hesitated. He didn't want to flee. He wanted to fight. But looking at Jesus, he saw that the Master was not resisting. He was surrendering peacefully. Peter took a step back. Then another. And in a moment of hesitation, he turned and ran away. The last thing he saw before disappearing into the shadows was Jesus standing, serene, looking at him as if he already knew what would happen. Judas's mind was in conflict. He had betrayed his master, but nothing was going as he had imagined. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured to himself. Judas had hoped that Jesus would defend himself, that he would use his power to escape, that something extraordinary would happen. But none of that occurred. The soldiers dragged him like any common criminal. The shine of the silver coins weighed in his bag, but weighed even more on his conscience. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push away the remorse. He could not turn back now. And then, Judas disappeared into the darkness of the night, carrying a regret that would soon become unbearable. The Roman guards knew that chaos could erupt if the population discovered Jesus' arrest. Haste was essential. They bound him and quickly took him out of Gethsemane. The night was silent, but Jesus' fate was already sealed. The city slept, unaware that when the sun rose, it would witness the darkest day in history. Jesus would first be taken to the high priest Caiaphas, where he would face a trial full of false accusations. Meanwhile, Peter would face the most challenging moment of his faith. Would he maintain his loyalty or deny the master in the face of danger? The soldiers bound Jesus with thick ropes, tightening them around his wrists to the point of burning his skin. He does not resist. He does not scream. He does not fight. He simply walks, accepting the fate he already knew. The path through the streets of Jerusalem is grim. The city sleeps, but curious eyes peek from the shadows. Some awake residents watch the small troop advancing through the stone alleys, whispering among themselves. Is that man the prophet from Galilee? Where are they taking him? The news of the arrest begins to spread, but no one dares to intervene. The fear of the Roman soldiers and the religious leaders is greater. The disciples had vanished. Peter, however, followed at a distance, hiding in the shadows. His heart raced. He did not know what he would do, he only knew he could not abandon him completely. The guards lead Jesus first to Annas, the former high priest who, even without an official position, still wielded strong political and religious influence. The door of the house opens. The light of lanterns flickers in the darkness. Jesus is pushed inside. His first trial would begin now. Annas sat in a high chair, his face illuminated by the fire of the lantern. His small, shrewd eyes coldly analyze Jesus. "So, you are the master who has caused so much commotion?" His voice sounds heavy with disdain. Jesus does not respond. His silence is a blow stronger than any word. The guards push Jesus closer. Annas crosses his arms and tries to press him. "I have heard that you teach the people in synagogues and marketplaces. What doctrine is this? Who gave you this authority?" Jesus slowly lifts his eyes and calmly replies, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews gather. I have said nothing in secret." Annas narrows his eyes. The answer was true, but it was not what he wanted to hear. One of the guards, irritated by Jesus' boldness, slaps him hard across the face. The sound echoes through the room. "Is this how you answer the high priest?" Jesus stands firm, showing no pain. He simply says, "If I have spoken wrongly, prove it. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me?" Annas realizes he will get nowhere here. Jesus would not yield to provocations. With a wave, he orders that Jesus be taken to Caiaphas, the current high priest and leader of the Sanhedrin. The soldiers roughly pull Jesus. He would now face an illegal trial, orchestrated during the night to ensure his condemnation. Outside, Peter watches everything from afar. He is scared, but something inside him prevents him from fleeing completely. Seeing the guards take Jesus to Caiaphas' house, he discreetly approaches. "Hey!" A servant of the high priest recognizes him. "Aren't you one of his disciples?" Peter's blood runs cold. His heart races. He feels the gaze of several people turning towards him. And then, without thinking, the words escape his mouth with "Me. No. I am not." The first denial occurs. But soon, others would follow. Meanwhile, Jesus faces his second hearing, an unjust trial, where the verdict had already been decided before it even began. Jesus will face false accusations in the Sanhedrin, while Peter will face his greatest test of faith. Will Peter hold on to his courage, or will his weakness cause him to deny the Master 3 times? And Jesus? Will he find any justice before the religious leaders, or will he be condemned before dawn? The story is still far from over. Don't miss the next chapter of this journey that changed the world forever.